Welcome to the third Stuhr Crazy podcast from Stuhr Museum, a podcast where we talk about 1890s history. We talk about Stuhr Museum, about the history we preserve and portray, and a bunch of other things in between. My name is Mike Bakov, and I'm the marketing director here at Stuhr.
And my name's Robb Nelson. I'm the exhibits curator.
All right, so our first episode, Rob, we talked about the barbers. Second episode, we talked about doctors and some of the medical equipment. What are we touching on this week?
So today the emphasis is going to be on all things tinsmith and tin-related wares, as you were. It's an area of history that we focus on here at Stuhr Museum. We have a tin shop on our grounds, and a tinsmith who is a interpreter here as well during the summertime. And we're here with Cynova, who's the director of interpretation at Stuhr Museum, and also Kari Stofer, who is the head curator at Stuhr Museum as well. And I'll be sort of facilitating an interview between the two of them and dropping in lots of flavor along the way.
All right, well, yeah, let's not waste any time. Let's get right into that conversation with our curators, and then we'll talk to Loren Miller, our tinsmith. I'll tell you what, I've worked with Loren for a number of years. Fascinating guy, knows a lot about it, so it's going to be a good conversation.
Absolutely, we hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the Stuhr Crazy podcast. Okay, starting with the question on everyone's lips, why did the Tin Man rust in The Wizard of Oz if tin doesn't rust? I'll pose that to our panel.
Because that's the biggest controversy ever, right?
I think so.
Well, it would be on other people. People that know tin would go, wait a minute.
Right. All the historians out there making sure everything's accurate. Well, I don't know. One option that I found was that his joints are made of steel or iron, so therefore that's why she has to oil those parts. But, you know, the movie and the book are completely different, so there's quite a few varieties. Kay has a different, more scientific theory.
I use tin cups. I use tin pots. I use tin coffee pots. If you scratch tin is applied to sheet steel. If you scratch that tin, you will get to the steel. Steel rusts.
There you go.
Perfect explanation.
Okay, let's move into the meat of this interview. Tinsmithing and working with tin is a pretty old profession. In my own research, I found that this dates back to the Roman Empire invading what was then Britannia in the 4th decade of the modern era. Do you guys want to talk about that? Just kind of the history of this and how it became what it did ultimately become in the 19th century?
Well, what little I know of that is that's not particularly my era, but they knew that there were tin deposits there, and so they were once they started to work with some of these metals, people were going where they knew that those deposits were.
Right. So there was a huge deposit in Cornwall.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we jump further into history down the road, and Cornwall has the supply, and then Bohemia started being able to know the process of putting that tin on the steel plating. And so then it really took off to the point where Cromwell went and figured out how to do it themselves. Little sneaking into the recipe of the situation. And then, of course, that England brought it to America. They tried to control it. I don't know if you guys have read a little bit about that there were lots of restrictions and stuff right in the beginning. But then it took off.
I know that England kind of cornered the market on tin production until after the American Revolution, and it wasn't until after that tin really took off in the U.S.
Yeah, it was really after the Civil War, I think, when...
Well, there was tin production in the colonial age, but they had to get their supplies from England. Just one more little kind of barb there that they could kind of hold that supply back or let it flow depending upon the mood of the day.
Right.
I think in my own research I found someone who was by the name of Edmund Pattison, who was maybe the earliest tinsmith in America in the 1790s, who was a Scottish immigrant. And this is right kind of at the beginning of when this trade really takes off in the U.S. It was really tin was really the plastic of its time that I uncovered.
Yeah, it's a clever way to look at it.
Yeah, they made everything: cups, plates, boxes, coffee pots.
And it was durable. It would
yeah.
last. It
It-
would be
it held
something you can
food.
take. Yeah, it wasn't 25 pounds.
And it was easy to repurpose if what the object was originally that was made failed in that task. It could be repurposed into something else. It could also be patched. A lot
Yeah,
of
a lot
the
of repair work.
tinsmiths would actually patch those wares so they could continue to use them. So basically repair so it would extend the life of that for a very long time.
And a lot of those repair jobs took place by people who weren't necessarily tied to any one community. They traveled about throughout the United States or Europe and made those repairs sort of in the way that a door-to-door salesman of the 20th century would do the same sort of route.
Yeah, tinkers were definitely one of the earlier
Yeah.
peddlers. There's a New York University historian, Hassia Diner, who says probably no one would have moved to Oregon or Nebraska in their frontier days had they not believed they would shortly have pots and pans, dishes and silverware, tablecloths, eyeglasses, and so forth, which I think is really interesting because,
Yeah.
you know, probably wouldn't want to settle somewhere unless you knew somebody was going to find you with the things you couldn't carry in your own little cart.
Yeah, all those things that you had to leave behind, you wanted to be able to be assured that at some point in time you're going to have a chance to get those things back.
Yep. And, you know, and that worked well for the tinsmiths and for the other peddlers because they knew there was disposable income out here that they had no place to put it. So they knew that they would be able to sell their wares too.
Yeah. So just kind of getting into our own collection and our own museum. Like I said earlier, the Stuhr Museum does have its own tinsmith shop on our grounds. How did that kind of come about? How did we end up with a tinsmith shop? And is there a tie to the Hall County region that we're in as a result of that?
Well, we had a number of tinsmiths throughout the years here in Grand Island, Hall County area. There were some in Wood River. There were some in Grand Island. One company that actually was started by James Cleary, who was an early settler here in the area. He was a tinsmith, but he also had a hardware concern that eventually became the Hinkie Lohman concern. And they ended up with two separate industries, a hardware trade and also sheet metal, kind of like the heating and air type industry, because some of the things that were made by early tinsmiths, stove pipes and things like that, the larger things, they had the smaller things, cups, coffee pots, and all that stuff. But they would also make guttering and all that. But Stuhr Museum was very fortunate. In 1973, we were gifted the C.W. Barber Collection from North Loop. And C.W. Barber was a tinsmith who learned his trade. He went into apprenticeship at the age of 16 in New York, where he was born. He apprenticed for 3 years. He came to Kansas and stayed for a tiny little bit before he came to North Loop. Barber worked for a hardware store in that area, but it became known that he could repair and work on tin. And pretty soon people were asking him to make things. One account I read in the documentation we have from him is 1 year, everybody in his family, he made them all dustpans. So he would make all these different little things. We're fortunate that we got, as a part of that donation, all of his tools, the little hand crank tools, as well as a large number of his original patterns. And you'll learn more about that from Mr. Miller, but it includes things that have to do with guttering and things like that, but also some cookie cutters.
Yeah. I've heard that the cookie cutters back then, or at least in my own research, were a lot bigger, and maybe they weren't even called cookies so much. Kari, I think you were talking about that.
Yeah, so there were cake cutters or cake stamps, which was really interesting, so that they would have used it on, I guess larger cakes,
yeah,
larger
bits of dough.
pastry type items. So, yeah, you can get a cookie cutter, or, if you're in Europe, I suppose you get a biscuit cutter.
Yeah. Was that a common item to have on hand in the household of this period, to have cookie cutters?
If you look at the there are collector societies specifically for the tin cookie cutters, and there is any conceivable shape. There are some that are tied to ethnic origins, and there are some that are just tied to novelty. The one that it just cracks me up every time I run across one is the one that's in the shape of a fish. Uh-huh. Okay, so you have a fish cookie cutter. Okay, some of them were quite large, and some of them were real small. Some of them just real simple circles or fluted edges, and some of them were quite ornate. The tinsmith that came to the museum to train our folks here in the early 90s was from the Amana colonies, and they have very specific shapes for this very special cake that they make. But he also made a cookie cutter in that very same shape. It has a lot of different pieces that are cut out and that are not cut out, and so I imagine cutting that, going, okay, I can't get this part out, but
right.
It's pretty.
Well, and Loren,
pretty.
He's learned how to do quite a few, and I think he does them to order too. So
I have this bad habit. I will find a piece of tinware that we need for interpretive purposes, and I'll acquire said piece of tinware, and I'll take it to Mr. Miller and say, "Do you think you could reproduce this?" And Mr. Miller invariably does. He likes the challenge of being able to reproduce that.
Yeah, I asked him once if he could. I wanted to have a candle holder, but I wanted the pineapple as kind of representative of the Victorian era punched in it. And I think in 2 weeks, I had my very own Loren Miller original that I could purchase, and it's sought after and displayed proudly.
Yeah, we actually started having a functional tin shop in 1992. Bill Metz came to the museum in 91, the fall of 91, and trained a handful of people in making a number of the objects, and it went from there. Gene Hughes, Dick Sadoff, Lonnie Hughes, and Brad Roney.
A lot of amazing people.
A lot of amazing people. Albert Schultz, and now Loren Miller have all served as tinsmiths in our shop here. And so each one taught kind of the next one, or they taught as a group or things like that. And I can't begin to tell you the number of kids that have come through, and adults for that matter, the various tinsmith classes that we've had here over the years.
Yeah.
We've kind of talked about the different things that they made, maybe cookie cutters or candle holders or things like that. And those are all very practical creations that would have been utilized to a great deal, especially in the 1890s. But were there more artistic things that would have been made, or was this simply just, for the most part, a practical trade that was employed by tinsmiths?
Well, I think it started out as practical, and then, of course, inspiration and creativity leads to more things. And as the craft itself traveled throughout the country, there was a heavy influence that traveled down the Santa Fe Trail to New Mexico, and they do incredible artwork to this day on painted tin and things like that. Some beautiful pieces. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of the names of the people that would do that, but you can also tell their style distinctly by the way they rounded the edges and how they punched different things and so forth. And so I think there's a lot of creativity around here still, people using different things.
Some of the more unique artistic things that I can think of are going to be the 10-year wedding anniversary tin.
Right.
Because the 10th wedding anniversary is the 10 year. And so there's an entire collection of different things that you would make that would be maybe a little bit exaggerated size, or
well, of course,
kind of
you don't want to give like a teapot for a 10-year gift, so you got to do something different.
One of the things that I have a picture of is a tin witch's hat or a top hat.
Oh, that's cool.
Then there's a pipe, a tin pipe, and there's a giant baby rattle, and all kinds of different things that would be And my understanding, it was popular kind of starting mid-century up to the 1870s for these type of creative things.
We have
to be
in our
made.
collection we have a lot of tin boxes that are specified and individualized for different people that you would hold. I mean, anything from a pill box to something that would hold your hairbrush, or larger jewelry boxes or things like that, or just a trinket box for men. So for
I
the
have a
10th
soft
anniversary.
spot for the Japan document boxes, and also the Japan spice boxes. I find that I think I have a few, and then I have a dozen of these. But then I have given some to the museum because we needed spice boxes anyhow.
Yes.
So they have come in handy.
Well, yeah, and that's really handy to have the tinsmith as part of a living history museum, because he can reproduce so many things that we have in our classes or we have out in Railroad Town, and even for our visitors to purchase and actually hold on to. But a tinsmith is really invaluable.
Well, just specifically, if we have something in our collection that would be a good interpretive piece, we don't want to put the original out in
Sure.
the public forum. But if we can reproduce that item and state that it's reproduced from an original that we hold in our collection, that makes that piece really interesting as well. And then that way we can demonstrate its original purpose. People can touch it and get a good look at it. It helps to make that personal connection with the people who are coming through.
I think that's really special, something unique that living history museums can do.
Yes.
Well, I mean, and the need that we have to portray this profession in a living history museum really comes from the fact that this trade really dies out around the time that we are interpreting at Stuhr Museum, which is the 1890s. The trade of tinsmithing really dominated for the 100 years between the 1790s and 1890s, and then it starts to kind of go away as the country begins to industrialize and be able to prefabricate parts that are easily put together that don't necessarily require.
Well, and enamelware becomes popular,
Yeah.
and stainless steel
Well,
becomes popular.
And the
Eventually, the plastic.
catalog sources, they start the mass production of a lot of the things that a tinsmith might have made, and they could also make it available cheaper. It's basically the whole big box store supplying something that, or big box catalog, excuse me, supplying something that a local tinsmith might have made that they could get for a lot less than what they would pay the tinsmith for.
Yeah, tin
so.
is very expensive. So
What did these? So I mean, we mentioned that it starts to kind of go out of vogue, I guess, as a full-time occupation around the turn of the 20th century. Where did those people go then for employment, or how did they transfer?
Well, I
their
think
craft?
Kay had a really good example, from right here in Hall County, how you kind of, whatever you're working around while you're tinsmithing, you might work for a company that does heating and air conditioning. And so instead of making those things for that company that is now being replaced by stainless steel or something, they kind of work their way into that industry and become engineers and certain people in the heating and cooling industry.
And a lot of the tinsmiths were already working practical purposes on gutter work.
Right.
They were also, because the pressed tin roof material became popular, and that had to be repaired, so they might have gone that way. Stovepipe, working with a hardware store, they would work on, okay, now I'm going to make stovepipe. One tinsmith, Bert Wingert, decided to go into the production of these very large steel tanks. And so he was transitioning in 1906 from the trade of a tinsmith into making, for wholesale purposes, these large steel tanks.
Right.
And making those available. And that's the transition you see from James Cleary in his tinsmith trade, associated with the hardware store, and that becoming eventually Hinkie Lohman, and then the heating and furnace company that was a kind of an offshoot of that. Early auto manufacturing, a lot of people who are working with the metal, the thin metal, the sheet metal type things, I could easily see that transitioning into construction of early Model T and some of the
Yeah.
steel.
I mean,
that
that's
was
kind
used
of
for
where the
that.
blacksmiths transitioned,
Yeah.
was into the auto
Auto
industry.
repair and all
And so, yeah, I think anybody working in the metals kind of, would have naturally migrated that way.
Yeah, I think that you could probably find a touch of tinsmith in a whole bunch of trades
Right.
that exist today.
Absolutely.
What was the social mobility of a tinsmith prior to this kind of, retooling of the craft itself? Were they, middle class? Would you call them the laboring class, or what kind of standing did they have in their communities?
I think it's somewhere in that middle range, because you would have early on it was a trade that you apprenticed for. I don't know that there was a tinsmith school anywhere. So you apprenticed and you earned and learned from your master, and then you went out and did your journeyman and all of that. It's one of those professions that you don't really stop learning.
Sure.
You keep going as you age, and you learn new things, and you adapt to the period of time. Tinners might not have been making product towards the end of their heyday. They might be repairing more, but they would be trusted people of the community. James Cleary, for an example, ended up being mayor of Grand Island.
Oh.
So you go from hardware tinsmith to mayor of Grand Island at one point.
Of course, then you have the other side of it, where you would have tinsmiths going out and peddling their ware,
Yes.
kind of called tinkers and so forth. And those people had a range of different social interactions. And depending where you were at in the country, depending who your target audience was, there are a lot of like minorities or women that would, normally have to defer all the time in their lives. And when a tinker would come to your door, they deferred to you. So you kind of became their friends, and you kind of looked forward to that. You might even give them a place to stay for the night. And so there were close relationships there. But on the other hand, I think you guys have both talked about kind of the more seedy side of that kind of trade, and
Yeah.
how you peddle around.
There's always going to be good and bad people in any profession.
I do know that there were negative stereotypes assigned to a lot of the traveling classes or crafts, traveling peddlers, traveling horse traders, or slave traders, if you go before the Civil War time. A lot of those people had attributes that were associated with thievery or physical ugliness or unattractiveness, and just general features that were to be untrusted or distrusted, just simply because they weren't really tied to any one community, and they were just seen as outsiders.
Yeah, they
in
weren't
general.
known.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, definitely. I think you had that experience where, and I think it grew more that way with the peddlers, and eventually, the door-to-door salesmen and stuff like that earned reputations. But I also think that they also were, I don't know if early on is the way to say it, but there were some trusted people, like I said, that depended on those people to get their households set up and learn what's happening in other communities, what their neighbors and relatives 50, 100 miles away were doing. It was kind of an early communication thing. Of course, I think that broke down like a lot of things when the railroad came through.
Oh, sure.
And people were able to communicate in other ways. And then you kind of get that social mistrust building up, I think.
Yeah. I did find a song that was written by a 19th century poet whose name was Thomas Cowherd. He was a poet and a tinsmith in 1884, and he kind of, in one of these songs I found, I thought it was really interesting that he kind of touched on the social mobility aspect of a tinsmith's life in his aptly named song, Tinsmiths Song. So I just wanted to kind of read a few lines of it. It's kind of old-timey language, but I think it's unique to hear it. It goes, "Though our bench labor rob us of the favor enjoyed by the farmer midst fair country scenes, what though 'tis confining to make up tins shining? There's naught in the trade which our conduct demeans, then ply the shears, since it appears that our calling is honest and fair." So he's kind of talking right there about maybe being looked upon as not on the same level as the gentleman farmer of yesteryear, but
The shop owner, yeah.
exactly. definitely there was a negative and a positive aspect, as there is in all things.
Yes.
All right, well, I think we touched on a lot of aspects of tinsmithing. We're going to cut away for a message from our sponsors, and we'll come back with an interview with Loren Miller, who is our resident tinsmith at the Stuhr Museum. So stick with us, and we will be right back.
Today's podcast is brought to you by Platte Valley Tin Shop. For custom-made tinware and general repair, see Mr. L. Miller. For the Platte Valley Tin Shop on North Front Street, Railroad Town, Nebraska.
And we are back, and we are here with Loren Miller, who is our resident tinsmith at Stuhr Museum in Railroad Town. Loren, just have a few questions to ask of you, and just so we can get a better sense of what it might have been like to be a tinsmith in the 1890s. Just start with you. How did you get into tinsmithing? What is your background, or what brought you to this craft?
I think maybe originally when I was in college as an elementary major, I chose a metalworking class, and it was just foundry work.
Yeah.
So when I got here to Stuhr, my first position was in the photo shop, but the tinsmith was down the boardwalk a ways, and I'm not sure whether it was 2 or 3 years after I'd been in the photo shop, there was a need for a tinsmith.
Oh, okay.
And so I expressed an interest, and I went in and worked with Al Schultz, who was there at the time, and basically did like 2 days a week or 3 days a week. And I started just like an apprentice. All I did was his cookie cutters for a whole year.
Yeah.
And in the process, learning how to solder and get familiar with the tools. And that's basically how I got started.
I've read that this is a mathematical sort of profession. Would you agree with that, or does it come in involved a lot, geometry, algebra, that sort of thing?
Very much so. Lots of geometry. And as I've gotten more involved in it, trigonometry.
Really?
And I've thought, I wish I'd have taken trig when I was in school.
I don't know that I wish that even.
But yeah, a lot of geometry, a lot of fractions, math, and layouts and forming patterns and that sort of thing.
You mentioned making the cookie cutters and kind of having a few tools with you. Could you take us through the toolkit that you have used, or maybe would have been common for a tinsmith in the 1890s?
Well, in the 1890s, the tinsmith had a variety of bench tools that were used for specific functions, forming wires and what they call beads or flanges.
Sure.
As far as hand tools, the tin snips, hammers, mallets, a wide range of chisels maybe, different kinds of tools you find that will come in handy. But basically your hammers and your mallets and your tin snips would be kind of the basic tool supply.
And it's a softer metal tin, so it doesn't necessarily need to be heated.
No, tin itself is very, very soft, but since it's put onto another metal, in the 1890s it was steel, and that makes it stiffer.
Okay.
But yeah, tin by itself, you get a pure piece of tin, and in the shop when visitors come in, I have no concept or idea of what tin is like, and I have tin solder, and I'll give the kids a piece of solder, and it's just limp, almost like a noodle.
So, I mean, the tinsmith made a lot of day-to-day objects. Are there more difficult items that you have made or that tinsmiths traditionally made, and how did that affect the value of those objects?
Well, starting off, the cookie cutter, simple things, but as you want to build pans or buckets or pots or lanterns or lamps, the difficulty increases on the type of item that you're making. The simple cookie cutter was just a strip of metal. The original ones were hand free-formed around a shape. But then eventually I think they probably began to use a mold to bend the metal around. But when you get into forming like a box or like a cup or a bucket, there's a lot of detail in forming the edges for the base, for the bottoms to attach, and then the rim at the top. Some of them, the rim was bent over flat and folded flat against the surface of the tin. But eventually a wire was inserted in the top, and it was sealed in, so it required specialized tools for that.
Gotcha. We were kind of talking to Kari Stofer, who's our curator here, about items that she's requested of you. I think she might have had you make a candle holder with those kind of pineapple themed.
Oh, okay. I've forgotten all about that.
Yeah. Is that something that traditionally happened? I mean, did the tinsmith kind of decide what was for sale, or did he have someone come up and say, "Hey, I want you to make a chandelier," and then that's what became the focus of his trade for the next few weeks?
From what I've gathered, I think probably a combination of the two. The things that were in big demand were things that were needed by the household. In the case of candle holder, it would be for light.
Okay.
And it's definitely, as I've done it, it's an art form. And so I'm sure the creativity would come out if somebody had an artist flair.
Yeah. How many cookie cutters could you make in a day?
Probably a dozen, maybe.
Dozen a day. How many can you make now?
20 or 30.
About 3 times as many?
It depends on, how many strips of metal you cut and how you bend you fold the top edge or a hem at the top, and then just forming the metal around the shape of a cookie cutter. Like, it's kind of funny in the summer, somebody will say, "Do you have Colorado?" Yeah, that's real simple. It's a square. Or Wyoming. Nebraska has a definite shape, but when you get into like Wisconsin or some of those other states, it takes longer just to form it and
Sure.
and
Or something like New York State or New Jersey.
Alaska's probably the hardest one.
Oh yeah.
But then when you see some of the photographs of some of the original cookie cutters that these fellows made, the detail was rather interesting. Like a person would have a top hat, and when you come down, it'd have like a bump for the nose and the lips and the chin.
Oh yeah.
And it would just bump. But that was all basically done freehand. And so those fellows, and it was soldered to a solid back, whereas mine are all open.
Yeah.
I'll occasionally will make a solid back like a train, or anything that has a great detail. Then I definitely wouldn't make 20 or 30 of those.
Sure. Yeah, I can imagine.
Maybe 10 or 12, and that would be a real stretch of the imagination.
Or was it common for a tinsmith to be versed in the use and application of other metals, or would it have been strictly tin that they worked with and knew the most about?
Pretty much strictly
Just
tin.
tin. So you would, like, when you hear things like people were strictly a coppersmith or a silversmith, those sorts of things, it was
Basically their trade, silversmith, coppersmith. Although the copper would have been more of crossover than like silver would. You
Okay.
could use copper for details on some things, but basically it was strictly tin.
we were talking about earlier in the show how this craft sort of starts to be phased out with industrialization kind of at the turn of the 20th century, and other professions were kind of utilized, or tinsmiths kind of made their way into different industries. What sorts of industries would they have been best suited for during that time?
Well, as well, by the Civil War days, industrialization pretty much had taken over. Most all your tin work was made in a factory. And as it progressed after the Civil War days, majority of your tinsmiths went into what we would call hardware. So if you like in Railroad Town, for example, if you had a hardware store, you might have a tin shop and you were making roofing and rain gutters and stovepipes, ductwork for furnaces. Because in the tin shop, we have a collection of patterns that were left by Mr. Barber, and all of those, I think there's only 3 that are not related to furnace ductwork. And thinking about and he was 1886 when he first came to Nebraska. Okay. And he tinsmith clear up until 1949.
Wow, so he survived the turning of the tide there.
Yep. And so, from what his family had told me, because they come out occasionally, he made a stove. He made boxes. I guess in North Loop he had a cheese factory, and he made all the tanks for the cheese factory. Okay. And so, the majority of these fellows stayed with the trade, but the trade just transitioned into a different product. That's from what I can see.
I see. With that transition, did their social mobility change? Were tinsmiths viewed in any particular way that changed throughout time? Were they, would you say, laboring class, middle class, upper class, or did it just maybe depend on the individual?
I think maybe the individual, but at one time when I was doing some research, I'd read where the average tinsmith would have made probably $9 a week salary, which back in those days, you know, you figured if an average $1 a day would have been a wage.
Yeah. Wasn't it, I think it was Henry Ford had the first $5 workday, and that was at the very beginning of the 20th century. $9, you said $9 a day?
A week.
A week.
I don't know how that would fit in, but as far as a class, upper class, middle class, lower class, and I'm not sure, but probably a middle class, I think.
Okay. One other thing I'd like to ask you, just kind of the craft itself of tin plating. I know that some popular characters in fiction, like the Tin Man, would rust, but that wasn't because that the tin was rusting. It was because what was underneath of them was rusting. So really, we're talking about tin plating. How did that get made, or what's the process of tin plating, like a piece of steel, for instance?
Well, originally, the tin plating process started in the 1600s. I'm not good at specific dates, but it started in Germany.
We were kind of saying maybe Bohemia, and which is the Austrian area.
Since Cornwall, England, had the major supply of tin, the process developed, and it's a really long, detailed, complicated process. But basically, to simplify it, they would make sheet iron, and then they had to scrub it and clean it and put it in an acid bath to get rid of all the impurities, and then they would dip it into tanks of molten tin. And when it would come out, the tin, one of the characteristics of tin is it would adhere or bond to other metals very easily.
Okay.
And so when they would pull it out, it would stick to the iron, sheet iron. But then they had to go through a complicated process of polishing. And there was one step, the actual final step. Ladies would polish this with oatmeal to give it a shiny surface. And so as far as the length of time it took to go through this whole thing, there's a whole series of steps. To protect the tin, they would put a layer of tallow on top of the molten tin. So when they dipped the metal, it would come out, the tallow would stick, and that would help protect it.
So it would eventually, through corrosion or something else.
Abrasive mark or a thin area where the humidity would get through the tin down to the steel or the iron, then you would get your rust. And it's kind of interesting, I've read they call it a tin disease.
Oh.
The tin disease was actually rust.
Oh, okay.
And so hot dip tin, they call it hot dip tin, and that was what it was made and used up until close to the 1890s when electricity came into work and they started electroplating.
Gotcha.
And electroplating in the 1890s was better than it is today, simply because they put a heavier coat. And most of the electroplated tin plate today is used for food cans.
Oh, I see.
so they don't have a very thick coating. So the tin plate that we get is electroplated, but if it's exposed to the elements, any little cut edge or scratch, it doesn't take long for the rust to show up. But it's not the tin, it's the steel underneath.
I know that one of the things we were talking about in the previous segment was how traveling tinsmiths would kind of go around, and one of the things they would do would be to repair those sorts of nicks and abrasions to the tin products. Yeah, have you come across that in your own research about this profession?
The tinker was typically called an itinerant tinsmith.
Yeah.
And he would go about replacing or repairing things from traveling. And if he had a scratch or a hole in a bucket or a pan, then he would repair that. And the way he did that, he would build a dam of clay around that area and solder it. And then when they were done, then he would take and just flick it off.
Oh, okay.
So, hence came the term, it's not worth a tinker's dam.
Oh, there it is.
And so when I grew up, I heard people say, well, so-and-so, he's not worth a... And here I thought all these years he was cussing this guy out or saying a swear word. But no, really, going back historically, it was simply because the tinker's dam was just a piece of clay that they got rid of.
Well, that's great. It
Fascinating
is.
stuff in the history of...
On that note, thank you so much. I think we'll leave it there. Loren Miller, the tinsmith from Stuhr Museum.
That was a great conversation with Mr. Miller, and I want to remind people that you can come and visit Railroad Town on a limited basis. Check StuhrMuseum.org for information on that, but we are going to be opening up sometime in June is kind of the current plan, so we're going to take a look at that. But what a great conversation, Rob.
Yeah, I had a great time this week. Talking with everybody, talking with Kari Stofer, our museum curator, Cynova, the director of interpretation, and of course the great tinsmith Loren Miller. It was a really fun time.
Yeah, there's a lot of good information in there. If you want to share it, we appreciate it. We're hoping to grow the podcast and try to get some new listeners. So if you're a historian, history buff, anything along those lines, we'd love to get your feedback on that. And you can do that at StuhrMuseum.org, our website, where you can find all things Stuhr Museum. And what are we covering next week? I have an idea, but tell us what people can look forward to next week.
Yeah, so next week we are going to be joined by our director at Stuhr Museum, Chris Hochstetler. And the emphasis that week is going to be the Bell Cottage, which is another building on our grounds. People might be familiar with that because it is the birth home of the great Henry Fonda, Academy Award-winning actor, born right here in Nebraska.
Yeah, that's a fascinating building, and I know, there are going to be a couple different interesting conversations about that one and how we have to deal with everything that comes with that building, the good and the bad, and there's a lot to it. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that next week. Well, thanks for leading those discussions. It was fascinating.
Absolutely, I had a good time.
All right, we'll see you next week.